Morning mist hung over the affluent Greenwich neighborhood. A stately white colonial mansion stood in the Belle Haven district, where maple leaves were beginning to change color. In the meticulously maintained front yard, red and yellow chrysanthemums heralded the arrival of autumn. "Kevin, time to wake up," Madeline Peterson said, adjusting the collar of her Ralph Lauren cashmere robe as she gently opened her son's door. She smiled tenderly at the sleeping face of her 8-year-old boy, curled up in his Pottery Barn star-patterned bedding. The morning sun streaming through the window softly illuminated Kevin's chestnut-brown hair. Is it morning already?" "Yes, and Daddy's waiting. Maria has prepared a special breakfast for us." Madeline kissed her son's cheek lightly. Kevin, wearing Vineyard Vines pajamas, slowly sat up, still rubbing his sleepy eyes. Downstairs in the kitchen, Maria the housekeeper was busy preparing breakfast. She carefully arranged fresh fruit from the Sub-Zero refrigerator, carefully selected Greek yogurt from Whole Foods, and homemade granola. Her breakfast preparations were a small but genuine testament to this household's happiness. "Good morning, ma'am," Maria greeted her with a warm smile. "Mr. Peterson's coffee is freshly brewed. I prepared Blue Mountain specially for this morning." "Thank you, Maria. You always make such wonderful breakfasts." The sweet aroma of freshly baked croissants wafting from the Wolf oven perfumed the morning air. Richard was already at the dining room table. Her husband, an executive manager at Morgan Stanley, was dressed in a Brooks Brothers navy suit, reading the Wall Street Journal. A gleaming Hermès tie lay on the table, waiting to be knotted. "Good morning, Papa." Kevin came bounding down the stairs and threw himself at Richard. "Hey, Tiger," Richard looked up from his newspaper and embraced his son. "Work hard at Greenwich Country Day School today. Oh, and how about we visit the Bruce Museum this weekend? I heard they have a new dinosaur exhibit." "Yay!" The family's breakfast conversation flowed peacefully as always. Madeline, holding her delicate Wedgwood coffee cup, savored this ordinary happiness. A former pediatric nurse, she now found fulfillment as a full-time homemaker, actively participating in PDA activities and local charity events. "Oh, that reminds me," Richard began. "I have important client meetings in Boston from Wednesday to Friday this week. The project is in its final stages." Madeline nodded as she adjusted her husband's tie. Business trips were part of his job. Since his promotion at Morgan Stanley, they had become more frequent, but she understood this was a sign of his success. "Taking the Metro North again?" "Yes, I'll transfer to the Acela at Grand Central as usual." As dusk approached, their son's voice rang out in the autumn air as he bid farewell to his father, who stood holding his travel bag. Richard, shouldering his LL Bean bag and climbing into his BMW, looked every bit the successful businessman. "Bye, Papa." At that moment, Madeline recalled Kevin's casual words from that morning. "Mom, what was that blue pattern I saw on Papa's arm?" "What pattern?" "I caught a glimpse when he was in the shower." "Like waves." Madeline shook her head, dismissing the thought. She trusted her husband of 10 years. From their wedding at St. Michael's Episcopal Church to the birth of their first child and the purchase of this Belle Haven home, they had always walked side by side. Standing on the front porch, watching Richard's back as he got into his luxury car, she reassured herself of this. The shrill ring of the telephone pierced the midnight silence of the bedroom. The Tiffany clock showed 2:15 a.m. The bedside phone continued to ring, cutting through the quiet of the upscale neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson. The voice on the other end was attempting to maintain composure but betrayed tension. It was the tone nurses use when delivering bad news, a tone she recognized from her own days as a pediatric nurse. Yes, this is she. I'm calling from the Greenwich Hospital Emergency Department. I'm very sorry to inform you, but your husband has been in a car accident. At that moment, all the blood drained from Madeline's face. Her hands trembled as they gripped the fret linen sheets. What? Richard. But he's in Boston. I'm sorry. The accident occurred on I-95. He's currently being treated in the emergency room. Dr. Thompson is attending to him. Madeline had unconsciously jumped out of bed. Still in her La Perla silk nightgown, she rushed to the wall closet. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely fasten the buttons of her Burberry coat. Her reflection in the mirror looked ready to crumble. Kevin, what about Kevin? Various thoughts swirled in her head. Should she wake her son? Should she take him to the hospital? Ma'am, please try to stay calm. About your child, perhaps later. No, it's all right. I'll make arrangements now. She picked up her cell phone and dialed Maria's number. The 218 displayed on the screen felt surreal. Though she felt guilty about calling so late, Maria was like family. They had a decade of trust between them. She immediately understood the situation and said, "Don't worry." Running through the dimly lit hallway and up the stairs, her footsteps were muffled by the expensive Persian carpet. Peeking into Kevin's room, she saw her son's peaceful sleeping face beneath his Pottery Barn Kids dinosaur pattern comforter. "I hope you can keep having peaceful dreams," she whispered, waiting for Maria to arrive. Meanwhile, anxious thoughts continued to multiply in her mind. Why was Richard near here instead of in Boston? The doorbell rang. Maria had rushed over, slightly out of breath. Her usually neat black hair was somewhat disheveled. "Please leave everything to me, ma'am. Go to your husband." Madeline thought she detected a hint of anxiety in Maria's voice. It wasn't like her usual composed self. Glancing at her Cartier watch, 2:27 a.m. She started the Range Rover. The luxury car's leather seats felt colder than usual. Her hands were still shaking as she entered Greenwich Hospital into the navigation system. Usually a 15-minute drive, at this hour, it should take 10. The midnight I-95 was eerily quiet. Emergency vehicle lights flashing by the roadside told the story of what had happened here moments ago. She could see a section of guardrail badly warped. Madeline instinctively slowed down. "Please, be all right." The prayer-like words escaped her lips naturally. She practically slid into the hospital emergency entrance. The usually welcoming hospital exterior now exuded an eerie atmosphere at this hour. "I'm Mrs. Peterson," she announced at the reception desk. Immediately, a middle-aged doctor appeared. "I'm Dr. Thompson," introduced the man in his 50s, whose expression carried a dark shadow. The Mont Blanc pen casually visible in his white coat pocket spoke to his position. "Ma'am, Please sit down and listen calmly. The doctor quietly began his explanation in the hallway, where the scent of disinfectant lingered. Fluorescent lights highlighted the sweat on his forehead. Your husband is conscious and his life is not in danger. He has multiple contusions, a mild concussion, and a fractured left radius. The CT scan results fortunately show no serious findings. A momentary relief washed over her chest. However, the doctor's expression remained tense. He seemed to be holding something back. But there is an important request. Dr. Thompson glanced around the area and lowered his voice. Something in his gesture, from her experience as a nurse, suggested this was not ordinary. When you enter the room, please do not open the curtain. This is your husband's strong request. The curtain. Yes. He's in room 304, but please. Before understanding the meaning of the doctor's words, Madeline's feet were naturally heading toward the elevator. The heavy brass doors opened. The third-floor hallway was dim, with night lights casting ominous shadows. Footsteps echoed strangely. Room 304. She felt a slight hesitation as her hand touched the doorknob. As she gently opened the door, she heard the regular sound of an IV drip. The green light from the vital signs monitor flickered on the white curtain. The mechanical sounds of medical equipment heightened the room's tension. Maddie. A faint voice was heard. From behind the curtain. Not his usual confident voice. Richard. Are you all right? As she approached the bed, she could see her husband's face. His forehead was bandaged, and his left arm was in a sling. His Brooks Brothers suit had been cut away by the paramedics and lay to the side. A frail figure, unimaginable from his usually dashing appearance. I'm sorry for worrying you. What happened? Why were you on I-95? That's the opposite direction from Boston. Richard's eyes darted around. Sweat dripped from his forehead. As Madeline took out her Hermes handkerchief to wipe it away, her husband suddenly pulled back. The curtain, don't open it, please. A trembling voice. A pale face. Clearly different from the usual Richard. In 10 years of marriage, she had never seen her husband like this. And then, from behind the curtain, came a faint sound. The sound of someone holding their breath. Madeline's hand naturally reached for the curtain. Richard, what are you? As her hand gripped the curtain with force, her husband tried desperately to stop her. But it was too late. The white curtain slowly opened. On the opposite bed lay a young woman. On her right arm, which possessed a refined beauty, was tattooed a wave-like pattern. And on the sofa beside her, a little girl was curled up sleeping. Are you his wife? The woman's voice broke the silence. In it mixed fear, resignation, and a strange relief. I am Angela Wilson. Madeline's vision distorted. In her mind, memories of the past 10 years raced by like a film strip. Wedding vows. Kevin's birth. Weekend brunches. And her husband's numerous business trips. Everything was being tinted a different color. Richard, this is. Her husband, when she turned to him, had his eyes closed. But his unstoppable tears told everything. I'm sorry, truly, sorry. His hoarse voice echoed. The monitor's warning sound indicated Richard's agitation. Mommy. The little girl on the sofa had awakened. About 5 years old, perhaps. A lovely face bearing Richard's features. Emily, it's okay, Angela embraced her daughter. Just stay quiet for a moment. Madeline's legs trembled. She collapsed into a chair by the wall. How long? Angela answered that question. 10 years ago, at a reunion in Boston. Those words sent Madeline's memory racing back. Fall 2014. The weekend Richard went to Boston for what he called an important meeting with clients. His somewhat radiant expression when he returned. At first, I thought it was just an affair, Angela's voice trembled. But when I found out I was pregnant, Richard promised to sort everything out. Richard's lying figure looked pathetic. The true face of her husband, who had worn the mask of a successful man in his expensive suits, was now exposed. Did your colleagues at Morgan Stanley know? A small nod answered her question. They were cooperative. The expense processing, schedule adjustments, everything was covered up by the company. At that moment, something inside Madeline crumbled with an audible sound. Everything she had trusted was collapsing like a castle made of sand. Tonight, Angela continued. Richard was on his way back from Boston. But he was tired, hit the guardrail. A nurse entered the room. The monitor's warning sound had grown louder. I'm sorry, but could you both step out for a moment? In the hallway, Madeline and Angela. A heavy silence fell between them. I didn't know anything either, Angela said in a trembling voice. That he was married, that he had another family. Outside the window, the night was still dark. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance. Emily. Madeline finally squeezed out the words. How old is she? 5. She's in kindergarten. At those words, Madeline closed her eyes. When Kevin was 3. When Richard's business trips started becoming more frequent. Everything was connecting like pieces of a puzzle. The financial aspects. Richard manipulated company expenses. Angela's voice broke off. The Boston condominium too, under the company name. The clock showed 4 a.m. The darkest hour of the night. But this was not the end, merely the beginning of a new nightmare. The nurse returned. You can both come back in now. Back in the room, Richard seemed somewhat calmer. However, his eyes, unable to meet either woman's gaze, remained fixed on the ceiling. Talk, Madeline's voice was cold as ice. Tell us everything. Richard's confession began. The meeting 10 years ago. The start of his double life. The company-wide cover-up. Fraudulent accounting. Everything poured out unstoppably. At first, I intended to end it, but then Emily was born. Each word cut into Madeline's heart. The weekly business trips, all lies. Maddie. Don't call me that, Madeline's voice shook. You've lost that right. Outside the window, it was beginning to grow light. Dawn was approaching. However, the darkness in Madeline's heart only grew deeper. Emily timidly approached the bed. "Papa, are you okay?" At that innocent voice, the air in the room froze. Madeline closed her eyes involuntarily. It overlapped with Kevin's voice. The pure voice of a child worried about their father. "For 10 years," Angela said in a hollow voice. "We were both living with different faces of the same man." The morning sun was beginning to shine through the hospital window. The start of a new day. But everyone in this room knew nothing would ever return to how it was before. The next morning, the lobby of Greenwich Hospital was already bustling. Visitors, medical staff in white coats, the smell of medicines. The usual hospital scene felt strange to Madeline. Mrs. Peterson. Turning around, there stood a man in a gray suit. Detective James Martinez from the Greenwich Police Department. A mild-mannered man in his mid-50s. "Could I have a moment of your time?" Facing each other in the hospital cafeteria. Steam rising from the coffee softly enveloped Madeline's tired expression. "First, let me express my sympathies," Detective Martinez quietly began. "While I hate to trouble you in such circumstances." "I understand," Madeline answered in a somewhat hollow voice. "It's about my husband's fraud, isn't it?" "Yes. Morgan Stanley has already filed a complaint." Madeline closed her eyes. Events were unfolding faster than she had imagined. "As far as we've determined." The detective glanced at his file. "Over the past 7 years, approximately $2 million in fraudulent expense claims. Falsified travel expenses, fictitious client entertainment costs." Each number stabbed at Madeline's heart. Her husband had used this much money to maintain his lies. And the condominium for the Wilson family. A property in the Back Bay area. This too was purchased under the company name. Through the cafeteria window, she could see the hospital courtyard. Maple leaves sparkled in the morning sun. The world of yesterday already felt like a distant past. "Ma'am, I apologize, but..." The detective's voice grew cautious. "You really knew nothing about any of this?" "No," Madeline answered firmly. "If I had known, this wouldn't..." Her words caught in her throat. Tears welled up. Then, brisk footsteps approached. "Mrs. Peterson." A clear voice. Turning around, there stood a woman in a stylish pantsuit. "I'm Sarah Matthews, partner at Greenwich Legal Associates." Detective Martinez gave a slight bow. They clearly knew each other. "Any further questioning will be conducted in my presence." Sarah's voice carried unwavering confidence. A Yale Law School graduate known for handling cases involving women's rights, she was an accomplished attorney who Julie, Madeline's best friend, had immediately arranged for her. "Very well," the detective nodded politely. "We'll continue this later." Sarah sat across from Madeline after confirming the detective had left. "Everything will be all right." Her voice combined professional coolness with feminine warmth. "Leave it all to me." Around noon, room 304. Richard's color had improved somewhat. But his eyes still stared vacantly into space. "Tell us everything," Sarah's voice rang out calmly. And so the confession began. It all started with that reunion meeting 10 years ago. Angela's pregnancy. His panicked decisions. Consulting with his company's superiors. And then the organizational cover-up. Vice President Graham suggested it. Richard's voice trembled. "We can handle this internally," he said. Falsified travel records. Fictitious client meetings. Everything was covered up by the organization's power. Traveling between Boston and New York for weekly business trips. Richard's voice gradually grew smaller. "At first, I intended to sort everything out. But as time passed..." Coward. A quiet but icy voice. Angela was standing in the hospital room. "Me, him, the children, we were all living in your lies." Madeline stared out the window. A familiar car was parked in the hospital parking lot. Maria had brought Kevin. "Our son will be here soon." At those words, the blood drained from Richard's face. "Maddie." "Don't call me that anymore." Madeline's voice was cold as ice. "You've lost that right." Sarah cleared her throat quietly. "Now, about the legal proceedings. Divorce. Custody. Division of assets." Heavy topics were addressed one after another. "Criminal charges are possible too," Sarah continued. "Depending on the company's allegations, prison time might." Just then, a cheerful voice echoed from the hallway. Kevin came running into the hospital room. Behind him, Emily stood frozen, looking frightened. The children's gazes met. Siblings seeing each other for the first time. Their pure looks pained the adults' hearts. "Kevin," Madeline said in a strong voice. "Let's go home." "Ha!" "But Papa." "Not now, we can't." Behind her, the monitor's rhythm disturbed. Richard's heart rate had spiked. A nurse rushed in. Once again, they were asked to leave. In the hallway, Madeline and Angela faced each other. "We were," Angela said in a trembling voice, both deceived by the same lies. "Yes," Madeline nodded quietly. "But let's end it now." 3 p.m. In Sarah's office, they began discussing specific procedures. Divorce. Compensation. Custody. Freezing of financial assets. Rights to the house. Everything was becoming real. "I'll start the transfer procedures to Greenwich Academy," Madeline said with determination. "Kevin needs a new environment." Outside the window, rain had begun to fall. The cold October rain could be heard beating against the hospital windows. At the Greenwich Police Department, a new complaint was being prepared. Morgan Stanley's internal investigation had reportedly uncovered even more serious fraud. Meanwhile, in room 304, Richard stared at the ceiling, silently weeping. 1 year later, Greenwich was again dressed in autumn colors. The aged bell of St. Michael's Episcopal Church announced noon. In the pediatric ward of Greenwich Hospital, Madeline Peterson, in her white coat, was gently taking a child's temperature. "All done. You were such a good boy." 8 months since returning to work as a nurse. Her gentle demeanor gave comfort to the young patients. "Excellent judgment, Peterson," Dr. Richardson, the pediatric department head, called out. Your return has been a great asset to the ward. Madeline smiled quietly. Her former self might have been embarrassed by such praise. But now, she knew her worth. Experience had made her stronger. After school at Greenwich Academy, 9-year-old Kevin was returning from basketball practice. He had fully adjusted to life at his new school. "Mom, guess what? I made a 3-pointer today." Madeline kissed her son's forehead lightly. Since moving to their modest house near their former Belhaven mansion, their bond had grown even stronger. "Congratulations. Let's order pizza tonight to celebrate." "Yay!" Her son's smile warmed Madeline's heart. Children's adaptability exceeded adult expectations. The living room bookshelf was lined with books on child psychology. Once a week, Kevin attended counseling with Dr. Sarah Goldman. When asked, "How do you feel about your father?" he had recently answered, "Dad did something wrong, but he's still my dad." Those words gave Madeline a sense of relief. Beyond hatred and anger, there was definitely an understanding heart there. The phone rang. It was from Boston. "Hello, Angela." The former enemy had become a source of support. They shared updates monthly by phone, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing. "Emily keeps saying, 'I want to see my big brother again today.'" There was warmth in Angela's voice. She too had begun walking a new path. Living with her daughter in a small town outside Boston, working as a graphic designer. "You'll see him again at Christmas." Last Christmas. Madeline vividly remembered the day that siblings first reunited. Kevin and Emily had gotten along as if they were longtime friends. The appeal of the trial. "I withdrew it," Angela's voice turned serious. "I don't want to involve the children anymore." Madeline nodded silently. Greenwich Correctional Center. Richard Peterson had received a 15-year prison sentence. Fraud, breach of trust, and negligent injury. The total amount of fraud discovered in Morgan Stanley's internal investigation far exceeded initial estimates. She visited him 3 months after the sentencing. "Maddie, no, Mrs. Peterson," Richard's voice had lost its former confident ring. "I'm truly sorry." Madeline simply stated quietly, "This is the result of your choices." Outside the window, the autumn twilight was deepening. The maple leaves were changing color, just like last year. At night, after Kevin went to sleep, Madeline often wrote in her diary. It was her time for organizing thoughts and healing. "Dear self," she would begin. "Today, I feel I've taken another step forward. The scars are healing slowly. But they won't disappear. Rather, they're proof of our strength." Like the wave-shaped tattoo on Angela's arm. In the back of the closet, their wedding photo album still lay sleeping. Someday, she would find the courage to open it. But there was no need to rush. Life takes unexpected turns. Madeline put down her pen. Outside the window, the full moon was shining. The streets of Greenwich were wrapped in the quiet evening shroud. Within the unchanging daily routine, a new life was surely taking root. And so began the curtain rise on her second act. Madeline and Kevin. Angela and Emily. Each family taking new steps forward. While the past couldn't be erased, the future still held infinite possibilities. And what were once scars had now become their proof of survival. Like the wave tattoo, they were proud medals telling the story of life's ups and downs.